Hello again. This is our chapter 12, or excuse me, week 12 lecture of Business Administration 602. And what we're going to do in class today is we're going to combine the cost structures from the last lecture with the supply and demand models from 3 lectures ago. This is before the first exam. And we're going to introduce the idea of perfect competition both in a market and a firm. So we're going to formalize that supply and demand model and show you how that interacts with an individual firm. And then in the next lecture, we're going to introduce the monopoly market. And then we'll compare them as we go forward. So just a couple of basic ideas to consider. Economic models are built around assumptions that allow us to structure something that helps us better understand the real world. So in any scientific view of the world, you have to build these models, and the reason for them is to get everybody on the same page and build a hypothesis that can be refuted, something that can be disproved. That's the basis of science in this setting. And so what we're going to talk about here are markets, and in economics, markets describe states of nature. So we're not when we talk about competition, we're talking about a state of nature, not a verb to compete. When we're talking about monopoly, we're talking about a state of nature. And so we begin the market model by making some explicit assumptions about the market itself. And here we say for perfect competition we have an infinite number, our assumptions are an infinite number of firms who are supplying goods or services, an infinite number of buyers. The buyers and sellers have perfect information about each other and about price. We dispense with location or the geography of this model. We're exchanging a single product with again with firms that are homogeneous and consumers that are homogeneous. So that's a very odd set of assumptions, but in the real world that might mean a firm that's producing a very similar product like white men's t-shirts. There's a dozen of them, different brands that are made out of cotton that are largely very similar, and then there are a very large number of buyers. And the idea isn't that you have infinite buyers and sellers. That's good for the assumption, but the idea is that there's enough sellers that no particular seller can influence the market price, that they can't achieve some higher price for their product. And the same thing for buyers. There are enough buyers that one person can't influence the market price by purchasing so many of the items. And so that's a reasonable assumption and would describe a number of markets: grocery stores, labor markets in a large urban place for minimum wage work, fast food restaurants, those sorts of things. So there are a lot of circumstances where perfect competition or something nearby that is achievable in the real world. And then we go through what I have characterized as the competitive spectrum. We go from perfect competition, this very strict assumption of everybody as a price taker, to monopoly, where you have a single firm that has barriers to entry. There are an infinite number of buyers, so the buyers can't influence the price, but the sellers can. There's a single seller, and in both these markets the sellers are going to profit maximize. And so we're not assuming that firms can set whatever price they want. It's that they're profit maximizing, and that assumption, at least in the short run, would drive their decisions about how to price. So let's begin by drawing here that first market model, and I'm going to draw kind of carefully within the constraints of my ability to, initially a supply and demand model. And so here is a large Q. This is the familiar supply and demand model from, I think, lecture 9. We have a demand curve that slopes downward, and we have a supply curve that slopes upward, and we have an equilibrium price for this product. Let's call that P, and we'll star that. All right, so that's the market model, where we have price and quantity in the market. And I'm going to leave out some things here that aren't germane to this because it's going to be a busy graph. And so this is the market of supply and demand that we illustrated in the earlier class. You saw it in the guest lectures, and it was what I was looking for in the first question of the exam. This is the basis for that supply and demand model, right? You couldn't estimate it because the data here only observed this area of the equality of supply and demand in different locations for housing, not a linear function of these, as many of you found out if you graphed them. But we want to take this information of this basic perfectly competitive market model and describe what happens in an individual firm. And so we'll draw this over here to the right of it, as is the common technique. Whoa. Let me undo that and see if I can draw better. You'll excuse me, I had a pretty bad kindergarten experience with drawing. And so we're going to show here the market, and over here the firm. And we're going to illustrate in this firm example when we'll use a small letter Q to describe the quantity in the firm itself. And so we're going to begin with by drawing that price all the way to the firm over here. Okay, and we're going to again, this is price. We'll recall that because there's an infinite number of sellers, no firm can control the price. So the demand curve for the individual firm is horizontal, not downward sloping. So for the firm itself, this price is also the demand curve, right? And it also turns out for this firm that that price is also the marginal revenue curve. You can't influence the price, so each additional unit that you sell is an additional unit of revenue. So at the margin, if you sell another unit, your revenue will be unchanged. Now, this then has a market, and we have here a representative firm. We could draw an infinite number of these to the right, but remember one of the assumptions that these firms are homogeneous, and so drawing one with the same cost structure and demand structure identifies all of them. So this is really this individual firm. So what we're going to do now is take the cost curves from the last set of lectures, and I'm going to begin with the average total cost curve, which is U-shaped. Right, so this is the average total cost. The average variable cost is underneath that. This is the average variable cost. And if I drew that better, you would note that these converge the farther we go out. And really, I would wish, let's just assume that that is tangent to that demand curve, and I'll explain why in just a minute. And then we have a marginal cost curve that strikes the average variable cost through its minimum point and the average total cost through its minimum point. Right, and that's what we described in the last class. That's a pretty ugly marginal cost curve, but the important part is really that it's striking the minimum of these curves here as we go forward. So what I have described right here is a perfectly competitive market in equilibrium. And that is that the price is equal to the minimum of the average total cost curve, right, which is also going to be equal to the marginal cost at that point. And in this place, the important issue that it's in equilibrium, so there are no market pressures for this firm to change prices, right? And how would that change? Let me change the color of my pen here and see if we can show you how we would get knocked off of equilibrium. Right, so we'll begin. The first way we might get knocked off of equilibrium is, let's begin and say that there's a technology shock to the market that causes the supply curve to shift to the right. So we'll have a new supply curve, call that S prime, and that importantly is if it's a lower cost, then we see the average total cost drop, and I'm going to redraw the average total cost here, and it drops and moves to the right, and then we'll have a new marginal cost. You can see why I'm doing this in a second color. All right, and so what that would do, let me undo that and redraw that a little bit better. What we're going to do is get a new average total cost over here. And a new marginal cost curve that's going to strike that average total cost at its minimum point. And we'll take it up here and mark it. And so what's important about this, if we think about what the firm, why we're having a model that describes an individual firm, is this. If we have a shock in a market, a new technology that reduces costs, and this could be as little as a tax cut on the product that's being sold, which would reduce the cost. It could be lower price for an energy input, electricity reduction, whatever. And then the prices are going to drop. And prices drop, the average total cost curve moves in this direction, to the right and down, so that higher quantity there are lower costs. And this will be shared by all the firms in this market. Again, we're really talking about the short run here, so we're assuming instantaneous adjustment. There's no dynamics, there's no consideration of time here. We can do that in later models, but we won't do that right yet. And so this gives us a new price. Sorry. Let me try to draw this right. A new price that would intersect the supply and the new supply and the demand model, and it should be tangent to, right? This is the new demand and the new marginal revenue. New price, new demand, and new marginal revenue. And the reason that we move to this point where the new price is going to be equal to the intersection of supply and demand, we talked about that in our supply and demand models a few weeks ago. But here is the firm level example of this. If the price drops beneath the existing price, right, then firms that are producing this, and that is because the cost drops in the market, an individual firm will have no choice but to reduce its price, because otherwise consumers will be able to buy what is essentially a highly homogeneous product offered by an infinite number of sellers in the exact same market. And so an individual firm is a price taker. They have no choice but to reduce their price. So think about a farmer. This is the commodity prices are the most common example of perfect competition. If there is a technology or shock that reduces the cost, or a reduction in taxes on these products, the price will drop. All firms will see their price drop. There's no firm, no farmer, for example, who's selling soybeans, who has the capacity to affect this market all by themselves. That's just not possible. And so what we observe is a firm in perfect competition responding with a price cut. And I've introduced a couple of new concepts here. I've focused just on the average total cost and marginal cost curves. Those are the two that are important in this issue. We'll return to the average variable cost later. It has some implications about what happens it appeared when we're trying to impose some dynamics or changes in time around here. And I've introduced this idea of marginal revenue. And I talked about marginal analysis before. Marginal revenue is just the additional revenue that you get from a unit that you produce, while marginal cost is the additional cost of that unit. And so firms are going to always profit maximize where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And here's why. If you're in, let me draw it just to sort of describe the marginal revenue, marginal cost example here, and I'll do it in a place where there's downward sloping demand, but it wouldn't matter if the demand were downward sloping or flat. You have marginal revenue, and we'll introduce that later on, and you have marginal cost that's going up, right? So if you were to produce here, let me change colors. If you were to produce here at this point, your marginal revenue would be higher than your marginal cost. So the profit that you're making at that point is this area. And so you would want to produce more than just Q1. If you were to produce here, your marginal cost is still beneath your marginal revenue. In other words, you're making more money selling the unit, more net revenue, that is marginal revenue minus marginal cost, by selling that unit at Q2, so that you would continue to do that until you get to this point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And at that point you'd be at equilibrium. You'd have no incentive to reduce production, right? Because if you reduced it, you'd be back in this range where your revenue of selling another unit was greater than your cost. And if you were to sell out here, your cost of selling an additional unit would be higher than your revenue. So the profit maximizing decision for any firm is going to be setting marginal revenue equal to your marginal cost. And again, that doesn't matter if you're a monopolist, if you're a perfectly competitive firm. So in this example, because the marginal revenue is taken because your firm cannot influence the price, you're going to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost consistently. So, but you have no control over price. If, like in this example here, you had a capacity to adjust price, you might have a marginal revenue that was downward sloping. We'll cover that later on. But the idea fits that you're always going to profit maximize where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So that rule of marginal analysis will guide all of our discussion for perfect competition in the future. And so, and then also when we get to other forms of market, I'm really going to stress monopoly market, not the other versions in this class, because it's the other extreme of that competitive spectrum. And so the guest lectures that I've provided are really basic stuff from introductory economics on perfect competition and monopoly, because those are the two extremes. And there's a number of market models in between, from workable competition and dominant firm models, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, duopoly that are price and quantity sensitive. So there's a large variety of market models with which we could interact with, but really a formal understanding of the two extremes is really the most important thing you need to take forward in an MBA program. And just understanding how the other market models might be more appropriate to the real world, but these bounding of all markets between perfect competition and full monopoly are important for us. And again, let me go over some things that could happen here. We could have the demand curve shift, and if the demand curve shifts, right, we're always going to return back to the same price. We're just going to see, because the cost curve here is sensitive to technology, right, or taxes, or cost of labor, cost of inputs. And it turns out that this marginal cost function here, right? If we add up all the different firms, turns into a supply curve here. Again, so the sum of all of these marginal cost curves is that supply curve. The sum of all of these marginal cost curves is that supply curve. So if we were to work on a model and change equilibrium conditions in supply and demand, it would then affect the firm here. But if it's a demand shock, it doesn't change the cost function over here. It would just change the number of firms. So the adjustment would be, if demand was down, some firms would leave the market, and then price would return back to the original minimum of the average total cost. And what's driving the adjustments within the margin, this market, are firm entrance and exit. Right, because firms are watching for profit availability. If they can enjoy profit availability, they'll change markets, or they'll either enter the market or exit the market. So that profit availability drives entrance in this market, and that's what we observe in the real world, that the capacity to make a profit drives people into those markets. The loss of profit or a negative profit drives firms out of a market, and that's really the equilibrating function in these firms. Either the costs change or the number of suppliers changes, and those are what drives the ultimate price changes. And so those are the really important elements of this perfectly competitive market. Now, a couple things about perfect competition. Economists favor perfect competition for a couple of reasons, and most economists describe themselves as free market or market economists, because we recognize that in a world where competitive markets exist, we tend to have pretty good outcomes. We tend to get labor being used at its marginal product. So workers are compensated by their productivity in the firm. Capital is provided based upon the productivity of that firm, capital provides that firm. Land is subsidized or paid for, not subsidized, just paid for based on its marginal product, as are entrepreneurs. And so those early factors of production that we talked about really drive the allocation of land, labor, capital, and human talent as an entrepreneur. And so people go to places where they can make the most money. They choose the occupations that are most optimal to them. They use their land or their savings as capital to that which is most productive, that is most in demand in the market, typically, and those are very good markets because they're adjusting based on consumer preferences, the technology that's available. The problem is that we don't, and in such a world as that, everybody's paying the market price, so there's big, instead of some people paying really high prices and other people paying low prices, everybody's paying the market price. So there's a lot of additional what economists call consumer surplus available. Firms are not price discriminating, so they're charging the same price for everything, and that keeps out firms that can't compete and causes that land, labor, capital, or entrepreneurial talent to move somewhere else. So that's sort of the economic wonderland, utopia. Would be all competitive firms. We don't have that. We don't have competitive labor markets. We have different rates on capital based on taxation between places. We have huge problems with monopoly power based on in regions. For example, hospitals are huge sources of monopoly. So major employers in rural places often are monopolist. There are longer-term monopolies based upon who produces what product. Governments permit monopolies to exist that distort market outcomes. So when economists describe the value of free markets, it's not a normative argument that we have free markets and we should always like it. It's a positive argument that free markets tend to generate better economic outcomes. And then we acknowledge, or at least virtually every economist acknowledges, that there are huge problems with this in terms of levels of monopolization. And the real disagreement in economics isn't that they exist, it's what's government's role or capacity to adjust them. And so that's basically the perfectly competitive market model. I've gone quickly here packed about an hour lecture into 25 minutes, and so our next lecture will be on monopoly power, and then we'll contrast the two. Thank you.